Hey everybody, it is no doubt my favorite time of year, and it is springtime, and we're going to talk today a couple different ways to rig different rods, either for casting or for vertical jigging. And you know what, probably one of the most effective ways to fish, especially deeper rivers, is definitely vertical jigging. So what we're going to do is we're going to rig up a rod for that. Got a bunch of new Megs custom rods. This guy does an absolutely awesome job. And one thing I love about what Pat does up there at Megs is that really he is a big time fisherman, and he's really good at getting like the maximum performance out of the baits. So building a rod for the baits versus just building a rod. And I hope that makes sense to you. Today what we're going to do is I got PC Fun reel on here we're going to hook up. We're going to use some super braid here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to thread this rod. So now what we're going to do, basically just going to do a fisherman's knot here. Go back through again. Clinch that down. Cut the tag end off right away. Now what we're going to do is, got that fisherman's knot, all I'm going to do is run it through, go onto the reel, open up the bail, and clinch it down. Just that simple. Yep, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start spooling this reel, and as I spool it, now this is a key thing, everybody, is that if you have a lot of problems with line, and a lot of times people do, it could be old line, it could be coming off the spool the wrong way. Remember, the line has to come off the spool the way it was gone, that it goes on. Typically, the top of the label is the way that should be upright, but it's not always the case, for sure. So if you're pulling your line out and it's coming out like this, and you see it start to twist like this, make sure that all you gotta do is just flip it over and start reeling up, and you'll see that line should come out straight. Now here's the other part. If it doesn't, in either way, what I like to do is that I like to spray that. I'll get it on there, and what I'll do is I'll spray that line down with that Real Magic. And again, little things make a big difference. Remember that when it comes to fishing. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do that about 3 or 4 times, okay? I turn the handle about 30 times, okay? Then what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna spray it down again. I'm gonna make sure I get it on there equal. And you'll notice the big difference that it's gonna make. Again, see how straight my line is coming off that spool? Not twisting at all. So I'm gonna do it one more time. Okay. A lot of times people end up over spooling. So that's about perfect right there, if you guys can see that. Don't over spool it. It's a waste of line, especially when you start looking at super braid. You know, super braid's expensive. I always look at it this way. You know, it pretty much costs you about $20 to $25 now to spool up a spool of super braid. So I mean, you definitely don't want to waste it, for sure. And that's the big part about using Real Magic. And the other part is too, and I can't stress this enough, when you're casting, do not turn the handle and let the bail close that way. Big thing, the bail is not supposed to close by turning the handle. You always should do that manually. Okay, so I'm setting this one up for vertical jigging. So instead of splicing that line together by using a blood knot or using an Albright, what I'm gonna use, I like to use really good swivels. Don't cheap out when it comes to vertical jigging on your swivels. Spend a little bit extra money, it's gonna make a huge difference. When you're vertical every time like that, lifting straight up and down, sometimes it's a soft lift, sometimes it's a hard flip. What happens is every time that the line is gonna start twisting like that if you don't have a good swivel in there. And then what's gonna happen is when you go to lift like that, your line's it's gonna start twisting. But the other part, the most important part is, what's gonna happen is that when you're vertical, you come up and you start bringing that bait down to lay it back into the bottom. What you want to do is, you don't want that to have a twister, because then that jig or whatever baits you're using, you know, it could be a shiver minnow, you know, it could be plastics, it could be live bait. You don't want that to be spinning as you're letting it down. Or a lot of times you'll do a slight lift, you'll pop it a couple times and do a slight lift and hold it there for that 1 or 2 seconds. And if you don't have a good swivel in there, what it's gonna do is it's gonna start spinning all the time. You want that bait to always, the tail of it, to be pointed downstream, looking natural as you're going. You know, the key to vertical jigging, and I mean by vertical, everybody, is that you're drifting with the current, the speed of the current, and you're lifting, dropping, lifting, dropping, lifting, dropping. So many times you're on a straight stretch like that, and what's gonna happen is that you're at 10 foot, 10 foot, 10 foot, and all of a sudden there's gonna be a little pocket there, and the pocket could be 2 foot long, it could be 6 foot long. But a lot of times that is where them fish are gonna be laying. They're gonna be laying out of the current, so that current's going right over the top of them. They don't have to fight the current. And the other part is too, they're hidden from anything that's getting pushed downstream, any type of bait that's getting pushed downstream, so they can ambush that. So you wanna make sure when you're jigging vertical like that, that you have your rods up high enough that when you're letting down, that line, if it needs to go down another foot or 2 foot, you have the room to be able to still consistently hit that bottom. There's so much to every time when you're jigging vertical to lift, hit, lift, hit, lift, hit. That is so important that every time that hits the bottom, because that is really what's gonna trigger them fish to bite. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna tie the swivel on here. So again, I like to use the smallest swivel that I possibly can use, just so it doesn't get hung up in the guides of the rod, and the best swivel that I can possibly use. Okay, most of the time when you're vertical jigging, especially in the spring, the water is gonna be murky. So you can get away with a couple things. You can get away with a shorter leader, and you can get away with using a little heavier line, because they're not gonna see it, again, because that water is murky. So what I'll do, and this is a really good tip, is that I'm gonna use a Palomar knot going to the swivel, okay? And then when I go to the leader, I'm gonna use a fisherman's knot, because it's a weaker knot. If the line gets hung up and it's gonna break, I don't want to lose that swivel, because then that's something extra I gotta tie again. And then, you know, anytime you're fishing rivers, there's a lot of snags. So you're gonna get hung up, you're gonna get snagged up. Okay, so I got that on there with a Palomar. So what I'm gonna do, and now this is a great little tip, because most of the time when you start tying knots, you're gonna tie the same knot on the swivel as you would on your leader line. So what I'm gonna do here, I'm just gonna tie a fisherman's knot, which is not as strong as a Palomar. Strong, but not as strong. And I usually twist it about 8 to 10 times. Again, go through again. This is the knot that I used as a kid, and my fingers tie it the best. But any time that I'm gonna go to super braid onto a swivel, I'm definitely tying a Palomar. Okay, so what I'm gonna do, cut that. Now I'm all ready. So the other thing is, you don't need to have as long as leader. Like if I'm pitching somewhere, you know, especially in clear water, I'm gonna go to a long leader. It could be 3 foot, it could be 6 foot, it could be 8. That's another key thing, is the clearer the water and the more your fish are pressured, that means you need to alter what you're doing for sure. You gotta remember, you know, these fish, their buddies get caught, they get caught, and you know what? They eventually learn not to hit that. So again, when you're fishing in areas where in most places in the spring have a lot of pressure, and by doing little things like this, it is gonna make you that guy that's catching more fish than anybody else. So all I gotta do is tie a jig on there, and you know, it could be a hair jig, it could be a regular round jig. Now on this one, I'm already tied up here. And here's another key thing when it comes to vertical jigging. We're using a stinger hook. Now when you're using a stinger hook, everybody, this is a stinger hook, and that's the jig. So what I like to do is make sure I use a stinger hook. When I use it, make sure when you hook it to the minnow that you have a little bit of slack in your line. So what happens if when you hook your minnow through the head, and you put it on, it goes onto the jig, and then you're gonna hook your stinger hook, because you don't want that. Some people like it just free floating. I don't, especially in rivers, because there's so much debris. So what I always do, when I go to hook it to the minnow, if you can guys see that, there's usually about 1/4 inch of play in the line, of extra line. So then I hook it into the side of the minnow, and then this way when the minnow is moving back and forth, it has room to flex all the time and look a lot more natural. Again, these are key things to do when you're vertical jigging. you know, again, I can't say it enough, little things make a big difference. When do you use mono and when do you use, like we just tied up here, a super braid? You know, that's a 10-pound super braid with 10-pound fluorocarbon. Anytime that I am vertical jigging in a river, I want to use a super braid because, again, you know, you want the maximum sensitivity that you can get. That's huge right there. But the other part is that super braid, there's no stretch to it. It is going to cut the current a lot better. You know, here's another thing to remember. If you're fishing in a river and you have your buddies in the boat, you know what, and there's a lot of wind and a lot of current and your boat keeps shifting, which will happen a lot in them kind of conditions, back and forth like the back of the boat. Most people run 18 to 20, 21 foot boats, 22 foot boats. It just seems like the boats keep getting bigger. If I'm in that scenario like that in the back of the boat for some reason, either wind or current is moving around a lot and we're vertical jigging, what I'm going to do is two things. I'm going to step up the size of my jig. It's going to be heavier than the guy that's in the front because he's controlling the boat. That front of that boat is as stable as can be. It's still. It's not shifting left to right, back and forth. But when you're in the back of the boat, you know, you can either move up towards the front of the boat to get more control over that. But if there's not that option, the room to be able to do that, you know what, and you have to stay in the back of the boat, you want to definitely step the size of the jig up. You know, always go up one size bigger than what the guy in the front of the boat is doing. Being in control of that jig, keeping it vertical, getting it to do what you want it to do, having feel of that bottom, no matter what you do, having that bottom contact every time, being able to see that line straight up and down and having that bottom contact is so important. And as a guide, you know what, I've seen that so many times. The guys in the back of the boat are snagged up all the time, and it's because they lose bottom contact and they either have too much line, which is 90% of the time that's the problem, or not enough line that they're hitting the bottom. So what happens if your boat constantly shifting back and forth, they keep letting out more and more line, and then you're dragging. And in the spring, for most of the bites that we're doing, especially early spring, that's not the technique. The technique is definitely vertical. So again, just by stepping your jig up, if you're in the back of the boat, to one size bigger is huge. And you're always, and I mean always, following that jig down. So when you're snapping it up, you're always following it down. 99% of the fish are always gonna hit that jig right before it hits the bottom. Like that last half inch before it hits the bottom, that's when they're gonna hit it. So many times guys will say, oh, I got him on the rise up. You did not catch that fish on the rise up. What happened is that jig hit the bottom, you didn't feel the fish hit it, it sucked it in, and when you pull back up, he was already on there. But a lot of times what's gonna happen, if you don't catch it as you're following it down, you just let it free fall down, what's gonna happen is that fish is gonna suck that jig in and spit it out before you come back up. Because what'll happen a lot of times is either you're gonna be jigging and you're not gonna know you lost the bait. Otherwise, what's gonna happen is you're gonna pull up and you're gonna miss that fish. You're like, oh, I just missed him, you know? He hit it on the rise. No, he didn't. He hit that jig right before it hit the bottom. You just didn't feel it. So the key thing, again, is using a high vis like I have now, using the super braid line, using a good rod so you have good feel, good contact. And this is another very important thing. When it's really windy, I go to a shorter rod. And you ask, why do you go to a shorter rod? It's all about control, being able to control that jig, control that bait. You know what? When it's real windy, you got the wind you're dealing with pushing against your line, pushing against the rod, you know what? So go with a little shorter rod, you know, like a 5-6. But if I'm in shallower water, you know what, and it's not real windy, I like to go with a little bit longer rod. You know, a lot of people don't believe in this. I truly do. You know, again, trying to get everything out of the day that you can possibly get out of it, to me, is very important. And a lot of times, you got your front locator on, you got your back locator on, that pulse is just pounding them fish. And if they're negative, you know what, they're going to feel that pulse hitting them, and that could keep them fish from biting. So by using a longer rod and getting away from the boat, especially in water that I would say is under 20 feet, is really crucial to there. So a lot of good points when it comes to vertical jigging. Hey, you guys, I hope you enjoy your spring, and you guys enjoy what we do here at Larry Smith Outdoors. Remember, like I always say, it is no doubt a great day to be alive.